Life is not what it is. There are things that logically are more or less realistic. But what's important is the interpretation we make of what happens to us. And each of us interprets life in one way or another depending on a series of factors. In the case of individuals experiencing constant hyperactivity, when abruptly slowed down, they experience anxiety. So sometimes what's necessary is to say, "Hey, wait a moment. You can't go from everything to nothing so suddenly. A lot of things happen." And then people come, and when they come for consultation, they ask, "Why did this happen to me, Liam? What's the reason?" And when you explain it to them, there's a sense of relief. Ah, this makes sense. I'm not going crazy. It's not that my mind is weird. And when you explain to people that there are things that are, not to say common, but frequent, or that there's a neuroscientific explanation, you feel much more relieved. The luck we have is that nowadays the mind and the brain are being researched more and more, and there's a search for answers. The brain is the great unknown, but we're entering, learning, managing, and it's amazing. I love to stay as up-to-date as I can on everything that's happening, and every time something new is discovered, you're immersed in a fascinating world. In my particular case, I always think, how can I explain this to people? Because sometimes everything is so difficult to understand because of the mind. But well, I could tell you things. For example, about the famous amygdala hijack that people often ask me about. What is amygdala hijack? It's an automatic response of the mind to something that happens, and you have a disproportionate reaction. It's like the amygdala at that moment has a kind of communication with the hippocampus, where memories are stored, and the amygdala is where emotions, anxiety, anguish are located, where we react. That communication channel has to be as healthy as possible. So if suddenly there's a memory that hasn't been properly archived, if suddenly you come across something related to that poorly archived memory in your hippocampus, the reaction in the amygdala will be very strong. So many people can say, listening to this, well, this happens to me with a person, or with an animal, or with the fear of flying, or with things that suddenly make me feel sick, or with my children. Sometimes one has amygdala hijack reactions in parenting because they get very angry at some action they see in their children and react disproportionately. So, first, as I always explain, it's about being aware that this is happening to you, not trying to see how to short-circuit that explosive loop in your mind. Events happen to all of us daily, and suddenly they affect us a lot, and others very little. Your child can come home one day having failed all subjects, and on that day you've received a raise, and it seems to you that the issue with the subjects is not a big deal. Well, let him try again. But if on that day your salary has been cut or you've lost your job, on top of your child failing subjects, it can generate a very negative reaction toward your child. That is to say, life is not what it is. There are things that logically are more or less realistic. But what's important is the interpretation we make of what happens to us, and each of us interprets life in one way or another depending on a series of factors. I'm going to divide it into three. The first one is the belief system. We all have preconceived ideas about how life should be, how I want to be treated, how I want the world to be governed, that is, on an ethical, moral, political, personal, and economic level. I want to live in this type of house. I want my bosses to treat me like this. I want my partner to treat me in this way. I want my children to be like this. We have personal and professional expectations, both our own and those from our surroundings, but also about how life should be managed. In other words, there are words, people, and political figures that automatically generate a reaction, and that's the belief system. Even the most tolerant person has a limiting belief system because often we want our children to be engineers, doctors, and suddenly a child comes to you, I'm thinking of a patient I have, who said he wanted to be a pianist. The whole family are engineers, and the mother couldn't understand it. She stopped talking to him because, for her, it was a drama. But her son had a gift for the piano, which she couldn't perceive. She couldn't see it. Why? because her belief system was that anything other than being an engineer was a problem, as they came from generations of engineers in the family, and the piano thing seemed nonsensical to her. Often, we have to break our belief system, and what I think is most important is to know it. What's mine? And we all have a belief system that makes us interpret things one way or another depending on it. And that's the hardest thing to change. When one thinks about a topic in a certain way, sometimes it can't be changed. And it's like hitting a wall because I can have a patient in front of me with a limiting belief system saying, accept your child, accept this issue in yourself, accept your past, accept that this is happening in your job. I don't want to, I refuse. And often, that resistance to change is what prevents us from enjoying life. On the other hand, we have mood. If one is happy, the interpretation of things is much better. I always remember when Spain won the Football World Cup with Andres Iniesta's goal, who is a good friend of mine and his wife Ana. I remember it as one of the happiest moments. I love football. I loved it. And then I remember the next day in the hospital, everyone was happy. People greeted each other on the street. People honked their horns on the street. There was a sense of revelry in the streets, a mood of happiness and well-being from joy. But let's get serious. That mood will determine our interpretation of things. And what does that mood depend on? It depends on how we sleep, we've already explained, but it also depends on circumstances. It's not the same living in the midst of a pandemic as living in a time when there were no virus problems around. On the other hand, personality, the interpretation of things. If you are deeply sensitive, it will affect your mood. If you are deeply distrustful, it will affect your mood and therefore your interpretation of things. And sometimes in this life, if what you want is to be a little happier, that happiness we're talking about, sometimes what you have to do is look at that aspect of your personality that is your Achilles heel and that prevents you from enjoying day-to-day life. If you're someone who complains, if you're someone who plays the victim, work on your personality because that automatically improves your mood, and that automatically improves your interpretation of things. And finally, what is called the ascending reticular activating system. It has a terrible name, but it has a magical function. It's an area located here behind in the brainstem, and it's a very primitive area of neurons that has multiple functions, but it has a very interesting one, which is filtering. It's like a brain tracker, and it's the area responsible for filtering everything that happens to me and keeping what interests me. In other words, our brain constantly receives a lot of information through the senses, especially through sight, but also through the senses, but it only keeps what interests it. If you are looking for a job on a specific topic and you start preparing yourself on that subject, your brain will do everything possible to find that issue. I often recount an anecdote that happened to me a few years ago when I was studying at university. I went to the United Nations for an event, an awards ceremony, and the rector of my university asked me to look for Kofi Annan, who was the Secretary General of the United Nations at the time. I started preparing all sorts of things about Kofi Annan in case I ran into him to invite him to an event at my university, but I never found Kofi. However, at one point during the event, I went to the bathroom and ran into a blonde lady with very pale skin. I started talking to her and told her various things, such as how the United Nations worked and about the awardees of the event we were attending. I said goodbye to her, and the day I returned to Madrid, this lady was on the plane, and I went to greet her. I thought it was curious, the lady from the bathroom, and she was sitting next to a guy who she introduced to me as Kofi, her husband. So, many times I wondered, how is it possible? Well, I had studied Kofi Annan, and probably my mind had captured pictures with his wife, and when I saw her, I recognized her. They say luck favors the prepared mind. You have to prepare, you have to study, you have to know, because those who prepare, who study, who know, perceive opportunities better. And the important thing in this life is to activate our reticular activating system. If you have it negatively, you see everything negative. Who is the main inhibitor of this reticular activating system? The screen. Why? Because the screen offers you instant gratifications, bursts of dopamine. It's a fake life, a digital life. Good things happen in real life. Those digital life, those bursts of dopamine generate moments of instant gratification, but in the long run, they leave us empty. Screens and the mechanism of dopamine with drugs have a very similar mechanism. That's why nowadays, many addictions to screens, to pornography, to video games, are treated with similar mechanisms as drugs, and this is a huge problem because we live in a moment of history, as the philosopher José Luis Ruiz says, we are emotional drug addicts. We are increasingly addicted to vibrant experiences that come to us through the screen. And why is this so important? Because all of this will hinder our prefrontal cortex. Here I enter a very interesting field at an educational level, at the level of parents, and at a personal level. The prefrontal cortex, which we have talked about several times, is a fundamental area for attention, concentration, problem-solving, and impulse control. It's the area that makes us superior beings, that helps us pay attention to what we want, to be still in one place and listen, to be in a bakery like me, who loves sweets, and not eat the chocolates while they are being served, but to control those impulses, to manage ourselves internally. The prefrontal cortex is a deeply immature area when a baby is born. When a baby is born, this area is completely immature and evolves as the years go by. It matures earlier in girls than in boys. Girls mature earlier in attention and concentration than boys. This is very important in the educational field. Boys are still into 1,000 things, and girls are already much more conscious since they are younger. How do you stimulate a baby's prefrontal cortex? With 3 things: light, sound, and movement. Have you seen a baby who suddenly sees his father passing by, or sees a light turning on, or hears a little music and starts turning his head? What do we want for that child as he grows up? We want this child to pay attention to still objects, to a teacher speaking to an adult speaking, to a friend telling a story, to be still in the waiting room of the doctor, and to be able to read a book. Still, that prefrontal cortex will mature, and not only will attention be activated by light, sound, and movement, but also suddenly it will connect with a sunset, a painting, or music, etc. In other words, with different things. But if you expose that child to a screen from a very young age, what is a screen? It's light, sound, and movement. What happens is that their attention will be stimulated by an external tool, which is that device, and the brain operates with a mechanism called use it or lose it. If we only use Wikipedia to find data, what happens is that our hippocampus, the memory zone, will function worse and worse. If one always uses Google Maps or Waze to navigate, we will navigate worse and worse. The less action our brain has, the worse it will function in that particular tool. If we manage to work on things, pay attention, promote our orientation, promote our memory, we improve brain neuroplasticity. In other words, we are in a time where brain neuroplasticity, which is the ability to generate new neurons. I remember when I studied medicine, the neurons we had were the ones we had, and there was no way to generate more. Nowadays, we know that having excitement in life causes a migration of neurons to the hippocampus, which is the learning zone. That is to say, today we know that there are mechanisms to improve these neuronal connections. If we enhance a zone of our brain, that zone will function better and better. In terms of attention, I believe that nowadays, we are in a moment in history where there is an attention crisis. People don't know how to pay attention due to many factors, because time flies, because there's one thing and another thing and another thing, because you eat a candy, and that candy has 4 different flavors, because you go somewhere and 74 things happen, so you don't connect sensorially with something specific, but there are multiple emotions and sensations, and all of this with the screen in between. That screen is what is making my prefrontal cortex function worse and worse because it's designed to alleviate. But what you're teaching your brain is that you don't know how to manage boredom, which is the cradle of wonder and creativity, and you don't know how to manage stress, which will determine your quality of life. A person with willpower goes further than an intelligent person and willpower is found in the prefrontal cortex. So what do I recommend to strengthen the prefrontal cortex? Willpower is the ability to postpone the reward, and nowadays, we are in a moment where we want everything and now, and we want to feel now, and we want instant gratification now. That is to say, instead of saying, I want everything now, food, etc., what I need to do is strengthen my willpower by setting myself small challenges. This week, I won't eat this. This week, I'll only watch one episode of this series. I won't buy anything here. I won't spend more than so many minutes on Instagram, etc. In other words, I'm educating my prefrontal cortex. I'm educating my willpower, and I'm able to go much further in life. And that will help me when I'm bored, and I let my mind wander. No great discoverer arrived at their results and conclusions in a frenetic moment. None was sitting under a tree and saw an apple fall. Another was walking through the gardens of Athens. Another, meaning, in a moment of relaxation, suddenly, an idea came. In a moment of frantic stress, you don't reach the big issues of life. If you've made it this far, don't forget to comment on the video and leave your like. In our first segment, we unravel the mysteries of neuroscience, offering answers that alleviate and reveal the complexity of the human mind, from the intriguing amygdala hijack to the need to challenge our belief systems. Beliefs, we embark on a fascinating introspective journey. Now, we explore the impact of the digital age on our attention and quality of life. We examine the phenomenon of FOMO, the chronopathogram that is so often discussed. What is termed the fear of missing out, constantly checking to see if something has happened globally, personally, or within the family. I dive into chats. I dive into news portals with a constant fear. Nowadays, this digital world has plunged us into a constant state of alertness. I highly recommend turning off screen notifications. I am the one who controls the device. I control the alerts, not the other way around, because something will always happen. There's always something going on. A chat in your children's school group, the news happening all day globally about anything because things are always happening. In other words, screens have turned us into individuals who find it much harder to relax, putting our minds in that sympathetic mode, in that cortisol mode, in that constant threat mode, so toxic for the body. On the other hand, we have chronopathogram. The non-stop rush from one place to another makes it impossible to slow down. For the person who suffers from this constant need for hyperactivity and hyperactive when abruptly stopped, they experience anxiety, and therefore, in those cases, sometimes what is necessary is to say, hey, wait a moment. You can't go from everything to nothing. You have to learn gradually to take steps down because your brain doesn't allow for such a huge leap. What it can suddenly generate is an anxiety attack, and on occasion I have seen this in consultations. Then we have perfectionism. The perfectionist, by definition, is the eternal dissatisfied, always restless, alert, because there are flaws in everything in their environment. This could be better, this could be done this way. My doctoral thesis, my work, my house, the order, the clothes, the children. And this ultimately generates a vital dissatisfaction because life has a very large component of imperfection. When one is very perfectionist, this can develop into obsessive-compulsive disorders, and understanding the impact this has on health is going to be very important. So, this maintained state of alertness, both due to chronopathia, FOMO, the digital issue, perfectionism, the need to constantly do things in this frenetic but fascinating world we live in, we have tools, sports, with nature. There are incredibly interesting studies that show that it's not the same to exercise in a city as it is to exercise in nature. Even these studies have been conducted by putting people in front of immense screens with a forest, with a lake, and seeing what happens in their brains and how they eliminate that cortisol and how all that well-being is managed. We know today that when one manages to exercise on the beach, in the mountains, in nature, they relax much more. There is a part of oneself that connects much better with nature and enters that parasympathetic mode much better than in a gym. If you only have access to a gym, then go ahead. because it's what your body needs. On the other hand, I think it's essential to learn about our body and how it somatizes. Then, as the first mechanism in the face of anguish is hyperventilation, the rapid state of tachycardia or alertness. Why? Because, as we discussed at the beginning, when I notice a threat, the first thing that happens is that my lungs and my heart change their shape. Suddenly, I take in much larger breaths of air. I have much more shallow and erratic breathing. But what happens is that more oxygen than it should, and all the change in oxygen and CO2 in my brain will generate from that blurry vision, tingling, that well-known feeling of discomfort. That physical state of so much discomfort at first has a lot to do with that oxygen and CO2 that leaves and enters my body disruptively. Therefore, if at that moment one learns to breathe deeply and consciously, they are capable of generating a state of calm within themselves. This has a lot to do with various muscles in my body. Among them is the diaphragm, which is responsible for all this happening. When I breathe deeply and hold my breath for a few seconds, and then release it deeply, and if I'm able to add a positive thought, I always say to think of someone you love very much, or a thought of gratitude, and suddenly, after a few minutes, my body functions better. In the end, it's just a physical movement where we work on different types of breathing, maintaining the breath, which is difficult at first, but like a habit, even for sleeping at night. I tell many people when they can't rest to try some breathing techniques before sleeping and how their bodies manage to enter that state of calm, lowering into the parasympathetic nervous system. I remember once I was on a plane, and there was a lady behind me who was very afraid of flying, screaming, and on the other side saying, "But breathe." And she said, "No, if what's happening is that I'm breathing too much." Well, I remember I went behind the plane to help this lady breathe, but she was unable to. It had gotten out of hand, and she was already having an anxiety attack on the plane. But when we helped her, she was able to fly and endure the whole flight. Nowadays, we know about mindfulness or full attention, which I think is a very interesting technique to understand, because it consists of connecting with oneself and being aware of oneself, of what I feel, of how I feel, of the sensations that come to my body. That is to say, sometimes people confuse it with a form of meditation because all this issue is very much in vogue nowadays. I think the important thing is that everyone has their own mechanisms that help them. After so many years, I have known all kinds of people who connect with different mechanisms that suddenly help them, and what is known is that people who are able to pause to connect with themselves with a thought, say something nice to themselves that helps them, not to be their worst enemy, not to self-sabotage while letting go of that flood of negative thoughts, it helps a lot. Whether you meditate, breathe, practice mindfulness, there are two things that are going to help this flourish better. And those are two tools: acceptance and abandonment. Acceptance that I can't control everything, or that abandonment because sometimes we get anxious because it seems that either we can handle everything we carry in our lives or we will break down. And when we work on all these techniques, it helps me feel better. But if what happens is that I seek to relax from control, what that will do is generate an even greater state of alertness. And I think that connecting mind and body, and knowing that at this point, to this day, I think it's one of the few things we know where there is such a brutal symbiosis, where the mind, the psyche, the soul, the body, all of it in one, and we can do it consciously. I think it opens up a fascinating world to us, merging the deep knowledge of neuroscience with the accelerated reality of the digital age. Valuable reflections emerge on the complexity of our mind and how we interact with the world around us. From understanding the intricate brain processes to the influence of technology on our attention and well-being. This journey invites us to question, reflect, and seek the necessary balance to thrive on this fascinating and bustling journey of life. Ultimately, by exploring both internal and external wonders, We discover tools to strengthen our minds and enhance our quality of life in this ever-changing modern landscape.